On behalf of the MIT Leadership Center, it is a pleasure to welcome today Donald Sull, who is a senior lecturer here at the MIT Sloan School, is also a global expert on strategy and implementation in turbulent environments. He is one of the authors of this great book, Simple Rules, which he wrote with Kathleen Eisenhardt, How to Thrive in a Complex World. So it's a pleasure to have you here today. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
So you look at strategy and execution, and that's a huge domain. Mm-hmm. So how did you and Kathy even come up with this idea of simple rules?
Yeah, I mean, there's a approximate answer, and then there's kind of a funny backstory. So the approximate answer is Kathy and I, during the dot-com boom, got very interested in this question of how high-tech companies, particularly those in Silicon Valley, dealt with complexity and rapid change. And so we did an exploratory kind of comparative case study, and there were several interesting insights out of that, but the most interesting was that we repeatedly saw that the companies that did the best job of dealing with complexity did not try to throw complex solutions at complex problems, but instead had a bias toward simplicity. And simple rules were one mechanism of trying to tackle complex problems with simple solutions. So that kind of got us intrigued. And the backstory, which is kind of a funny story, is well before any of this research started. Where I stumbled upon the power of simple rules was when I was in college. And I worked my way through college, and one of the jobs I had was as a bouncer in a biker bar. And so
there you go. The source of all great ideas.
Well, you know, and my strategy. So I was a boxer as a young man, and I thought, well, the strategy is clearly just throw brawn at it. Well, the problem is I'm a middleweight, and it was a bar full of heavyweights with nicknames, by the way, like Shotgun and Mother Killer. You know, like you don't want to know. And after my second trip to the emergency room in my first month on the job, I realized that the strategy of just throwing brawn at it was not going to work in this setting. But it was a great job, and I loved it. It was a lot of fun. So I came up with a set of simple rules before any of the theory, any of the research, to help an underweight bouncer survive in a bar full of heavyweight, rough folks to boot. And so the rules were things like, and again, just to give you an example, is don't let trouble in the door. So it turns out it's much harder to throw a knucklehead out the door than to keep said knucklehead from coming in the door. So if they look like trouble, I just wouldn't let them in. Another one was we double up for certain types of bands. So it turns out ska and heavy metal, every time you had one of these bands and there was a fight. So we double up at the door. That's when I really learned that just a handful of rules applied to, in that case, the specific activity of bouncing can, it kept me out of the emergency room, so that was a good news.
But it also speaks to the fact that there was a learning process going on, so that you set up these rules, but then what you said was, and this was the best one. So once you enacted these rules and started using them, you found that some worked better than others, right. And so there was some changing of the rules over time,
Absolutely.
Or more emphasis on certain rules than on others. So is that the practice that you suggest that people go through in organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a mechanism for allowing ongoing testing of a distillation of a very complex strategy over time. The typical advice we give organizations is a period of experimentation, of explicit experimentation and testing, and then you sort of say, okay, at this point we're going to solidify the rules and we'll kind of keep them steady. And this is particularly true if the rules need to be used by a lot of people, like Zipcar, for instance, a great example where Robin Chasen, her co-founder, they could have had a big, thick document to coordinate the handoff of cars. Instead, what they did is observed there were 6 common disputes, and they just came up with that covered some large percentage of all disagreements between members of Zipcar, and they came up with simple rules. Pets in containers, no smoking, fill her up, return on time. That eliminated a lot of these disputes. And so, but it was important that once they did, they discovered these, that they kind of settled on them. They couldn't be changing them all the time because so many members had to coordinate their activity around the rules.
It's also interesting because if you looked back to when people were thinking about complexity, very often they said that the system itself has to mirror the complexity in the environment. Mm-hmm. And this is actually saying something very different. Which is when there's a huge amount of complexity, the idea is you come up with simple rules that get you through that complexity because of this creation of a kind of complex adaptive system. And so I think for leaders of organizations, it really speaks to a different use of their time and energy. So rather than coming up with all the rules and regulations, or a very complex organizational form, or telling each person what to do, or being very directive. It speaks to a different role for a leader, which is to think about the strategy and move from strategy to what's not going right, and how can we consistently develop simple rules that help us improve the system over time. Would you say that that was a fair way of kind of thinking of advice of how leaders might use this?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's precisely how we think about it. We're not saying it's the only way, we're not saying it's the best way in all circumstances, but it is one that's well researched. One practical way to shape, without believing you can dictate, how complex adaptive systems emerge and the trajectory they go on, by exactly as you said. First having clarity on what you're trying to achieve, and oftentimes that's not the case. Then saying what's not working, rather than thinking of every interdependency and every possible interconnection and let's try to fix them all. No. Prioritize what's something that's really getting in the way of what you're trying to achieve.